This is Cornel Hriska-Munn. He was born with no forearms and a severely deformed right leg. Cornel's dream is to be able to play drums, but his disability is stopping him from making this dream come true. Just kidding. Here's Cornel making his disability look like a slightly annoying mosquito. We're all familiar with stories like this one. People who were born with severe disabilities, others who lost their arms or legs in an accident, only to rise above all odds and become more powerful and more successful than ever, all while making perfectly capable people feel embarrassed, as now it becomes clear to them that whatever the odds against them may be, things will never be as challenging as they are for people with severe disabilities. Almost everyone has this sort of mental struggle. Why can't I achieve my dreams? Is it because life is so unfair and the odds are stacked against me to the point that I can't succeed even if I tried? Or is it because I'm not trying hard enough? And of course, like any two sides of an issue, people are split up into two groups. On the most extreme left side of the spectrum are people who believe they are totally powerless and see themselves as total victims, that there is nothing wrong with them and that the outside world is to blame for everything that's wrong with their lives. On the most extreme right side of the spectrum are people who believe that they are 100% responsible and accountable for everything that happens to them. In his book, The Road Less Traveled, psychiatrist Morgan Scott Peck gives a name to these two types of extremes. He describes the group on the left as sufferers from what he calls character disorder and the group on the right as neurotics. Neurotics assume too much responsibility. They hold themselves up to a standard they can't fulfill, and so they always beat themselves up and set up unrealistic expectations of themselves which they almost never meet. Whereas those with a character disorder are the opposite. They never see themselves as responsible for anything. Both cases are considered abnormal, but Peck makes the point that the latter is much harder to deal with, since convincing someone who already takes a lot of responsibility to take it easy is much easier than convincing someone who doesn't take responsibility to start taking some responsibility. They hear the words "pull yourself up by the bootstraps" and they're instantly triggered. So let's ditch the technical labels and give them catchier names, like victims and bootstrappers. Makes fighting easier. Now again, those are the extremes of that spectrum. Most people are found somewhere between these two extremes, having a little bit of both. So if you're somewhere in the middle, you're gonna be thinking that the world is unfair, but that you're also responsible for a lot of things. And depending on where you are on that spectrum, you're gonna be influenced by both extremes in varying degrees. But there is a problem with that spectrum. It only describes people's perceived notion on who's to blame for their problems, but it fails to distinguish successful people from unsuccessful ones. For example, on the far right, we can find two different people, Bootstrapper 1 and Bootstrapper 2, who acknowledge that they are to blame for every problem in their life, yet despite agreeing on that, Bootstrapper 1 is very successful and Bootstrapper 2 is a total failure. The same can be said for the other side too. We can have victims 1 and 2, and both would believe that the outside world is totally accountable for all the misery in their lives, yet victim 1 is successful and victim 2 is a hopeless case. This is because we never made a distinction between accountability and responsibility. These two words may be synonymous in many other contexts, but in this video, we're gonna make a distinction. Say you're walking down the street and you found a banana peel on the ground. You're thinking, this banana peel can be dangerous, someone who's not paying attention or maybe a blind person may not see it and it could cause them a lot of harm. So would you pick up the banana peel or would you just walk away? After all, it wasn't you who threw it there, it was someone else. In other words, you're not accountable for throwing this banana peel in the street. Someone else should be held accountable for it. But even though you're not accountable for this action, you may still wish to take responsibility and remove harm out of people's way. You do have the choice not to remove the banana peel and walk away, but many people just wouldn't. A lot of people will choose to make the effort of removing it, and in doing so, they assume responsibility to make things right, even though they're not accountable for what went wrong in the first place. Now that we've made this distinction, we can accommodate for it by adding a new line to our graph. We'll call this line the accountability line and this one the responsibility line. On top we have the responsible and in the bottom the irresponsible. Now for someone like Cornel, everyone can agree that his condition is something he's absolutely not accountable for. He's truly a victim of the harsh and random conditions of our natural world. So he earned this spot on the accountability line. He could have stayed here in that spot, never choose to learn the drums or achieve any of his dreams, and no one could blame him one bit. But even though he's not accountable for his condition, Cornell chose to take responsibility, a lot of it actually, and here's where he is today. A successful individual, even more successful than many perfectly capable people who may have shared his dream. And he didn't succeed because of some privilege he had, he succeeded despite being extremely underprivileged. This shows that the responsibility line renders your position on the accountability line irrelevant. It doesn't even matter whether your idea of where you think you should be on this line is correct or not, because at the end of the day, if everyone on this line decided to ignore their accountability or lack thereof and start taking responsibility, everyone will eventually succeed. Now, this setup reveals 4 types of people, one on each corner of the graph. On the top right, we have the responsible bootstrapper. Their thought process is, there is no such thing as an obstacle, and if there are obstacles, they shouldn't hold me back from succeeding. On the top left, we have the responsible victims, and their thought process is, I am held back by a lot of obstacles, but I won't let them stop me from trying. Notice how there is practically no difference between these two, since they're both willing to take responsibility for their lives and are both equally likely to succeed. On the bottom right, we have the irresponsible bootstrappers, and they're thinking, there is no such thing as an obstacle, but I'm not motivated enough to try and succeed. And finally, on the bottom left, the irresponsible victim, I am held back by a lot of obstacles and I won't try until they go away first. Now, the reason we picked Cornell Hriska-Munn to start this video is that there is a lot of people who belong to this most concerning bottom left corner, the irresponsible victims, and Cornell merely serves as a glaring example which proves their position wrong. But we shouldn't solely rely on him as an example. You don't need to be severely disabled to set an example of overcoming harsh conditions and succeeding. History is literally packed full of successful people who all started from below nothing and became some of the most successful and influential individuals the world has ever seen, proving time and time again that your current situation is irrelevant to what you can potentially become. So regardless of where you find yourself in this graph, always remember this: there will always be more willpower than there are obstacles. And I'll give Morgan Freeman the final word.
But it's hard to, when you say that to some people, because they say, oh, there you go with a pull yourself up by the bootstraps thing, and, you know, you're just being respectable. Not everybody can do that.
Well, everybody can.